Bama bludgeons the East winner as expected. Now come the Buckeyes in a sugar-sweet matchup in the semifinal. The SEC gets one, not two, but be glad you're not the Big 12. 5 conferences, 4 spots. The NCAA even screws up basic math, and we knew that from the start. And what about the rest? Anything catch your eye? How about Ole Miss and TCU? That deal looks pretty peachy. The SEC in 60 coming your way right now. I'm Mark Rogers of Mark Rogers TV. This is the SEC in 60. So every Monday, SEC football fans. So I'm not just talking about bowl season, September, even spring workouts, anything like that. It's 52 weeks a year. SEC football. We talk about it for 60 minutes every Monday live on Google Hangouts, right about noon time, Eastern time. And understand you can't most likely catch us live, so we've got it on the YouTube channel, Mark Rogers TV, also at my website, markrogerstv.com, as well as podcast form. If you're running around doing your chores, doing your workout, podcast will be available in just a couple hours after the show. So Monday afternoon, SEC in 60 podcast. Check it out on iTunes or on Podbean. And, of course, follow us on Twitter at Mark Rogers TV. And, of course, we will discuss and debate some college football. And also we've got a Facebook page at Mark Rogers TV as well. So let's get down to it. And this is what we've all been waiting for. This is the big climax to the season, those big college football rankings. Now, for the SEC, not necessarily a lot of suspense involved because Alabama very secure at number 1 after that 29-point drubbing of Mizzou in the SEC championship game, something we basically all expected. Now the Crimson Tide moves on as the number 1 team in the country to the Sugar Bowl to face Ohio State. And really, once Mississippi State lost to Ole Miss, aside from Mizzou possibly pulling off the miracle in Atlanta, really the rest of the SEC shut out going into Sunday, Selection Sunday. And therefore, it was pretty much Bama and bust for the SEC, and that's the way it looks right now going into the college football playoff rankings. We've got a nice show for you with Hannah Chalker, who's most recently covered the Mercer football beat for ESPN3, and also right here on the SEC Fans Radio Network. So that's SECnetwork.com. SEC Radio Network. I always screw that up, SECradionetwork.com. You can catch her show right there with Dr. SEC as well. And I failed to mention that's why we're doing this show. Dr. SEC was kind enough to invite us to start back up the SEC in 60, something we had kicked around sometime last year, and asked us to come back with it on his radio network. So that's available at 2 o'clock Eastern and 1 o'clock Central on the SEC Radio Network. So with SECradionetwork.com, SEC Fans Radio Network, every day for the rest of the week, the SEC in 60. So we're going to get to the bowl matchups. We're going to bring in Hannah Chalker in just a second. I did want to mention some notable news in the SEC involving Butch Jones getting a contract extension with the Vols. 2-year extension, going to be making a nifty little $3.6 million per year, up from $2.95. I did the math for you. It's about a 22% increase. I think we're all looking for that at work. That would work out just fine for most of us. 11-13 for Butch, 5-11 in the SEC the past 2 seasons. Of course, he made the Vols bowl eligible with a win over Vandy in the season finale. So Tennessee goes to postseason play for the first time since 2010 under Dooley. Central Michigan under his belt. Cincinnati was the job he had just prior to going to Knoxville. I think he really broke through in 2013, showing us that he was recruiting at a high level, and it was going to pay some dividends on the field pretty quickly in spots. Now, Tennessee's still losing to the teams that they're supposed to be losing to and pretty much beating who they're supposed to be beating. But that 2013 flash look, glimpse of what Tennessee fans are hoping for in the future was defeating a South Carolina team that finished in the top 5 and getting oh so close against Georgia in overtime in Knoxville. This, again, 2014, I really respect what they did out of conference. They scheduled a pretty tough Utah State team that had finished in the top 25, Oklahoma on the road, and even Arkansas State for your soft cupcake game, or one of 2, actually, with Chattanooga, Arkansas State, a pretty formidable program out of the Sun Belt. the two close losses, and these are going to be the two programs, of course, despite Mizzou's success the last 2 years, that Tennessee is going to be looking at as the gold standard in the Eastern Division. Georgia, Florida, they played them oh so close this year at 10-9 against the Gators, but we would expect the Gators to be much better in the future very quickly, and Georgia 35-32. So Butch Jones, 2-year extension with Tennessee. All right, let's get to Hannah Chalker of, again, she's done some work most recently with Mercer Football, ESPN3, and also the SEC Fans Radio Network. Hannah, how are you?
Hey, Mark.
What's going on?
Thanks for having me on again.
Of course. What is going on today?
You know, a little college football playoff hangover, not necessarily alcohol related, but so much media and so much hype. Everyone's just trying to soak it all in and talk it out today.
All right, so we've got these rankings that came out, and at least from my vantage point in following some social media, there might not have been quite the outrage that I expected, because coming down the stretch, and certainly after the championship games on Saturday night, I thought, to me, and I tried to make this as clear as possible, Ohio State, TCU, Baylor, pick one, the other two have a lot to complain about, a lot to gripe about. The resumes are oh so close, and of course TCU and Baylor in the same conference. I don't know if the College Football Playoff Committee took the easy road out and said, Ohio State played the championship game, and we're not going to mess with the whole TCU-Baylor situation. I would hope they constructed the season from top to bottom as they talked about doing each and every week, and they came out with that. So Bama 1, Oregon 2, Florida State 3, Ohio State 4, and then Baylor, they jumped ahead of TCU on that final rankings. I don't think the Bears fans find much consolation in that. So how does that compare with what you think the Final Four should be?
Well, the committee had stressed so much that those teams were so close, and they stressed it the week before about how anything little happens between these teams, they can all, 4 through 6, were all very close. Well, I feel like the theme around College Football Nation right now is that despite these Texas teams that are not happy, the committee got it right. And the theme is a lot of people don't like how they got to this top 4 conclusion. I do believe these are the best 4 teams in the country right now. I would have put FSU at 2 ahead of Oregon. I'm still not exactly sure why they are favoring Oregon so much over the Seminoles at this point. But I do believe Ohio State, it should be at number 4. Now, it is a really sad situation for Baylor and TCU. I agree with Baylor over TCU. They beat number 9 Kansas State. That's a huge game that boosted their resume over TCU, who only played an unranked Ohio State. Now, I believe TCU had no business being number 3 in the college ball rankings at all, and that we saw they were number 4 on the AP poll. I don't think they ever should have been ahead of Baylor, and they ever should have been in the top 4. But I believe the theme around college football right now is that the committee did get it right. Did they do the right thing leading up to this? It's hard to say. You know, we're not using computer systems anymore. We're using people, and they're human too. We heard the committee yesterday, if you watched the broadcast, how they really relied on the coaches. You know, a room full of men, and they were basically letting the coaches talk and give their opinions and really absorbing all of that in the room. So I don't know. What do you think? Think they got it right?
Well, of course I don't.
Of course you don't.
I think they got the right 4 teams. And when I say the right 4 teams, I really hate to exclude TCU and Baylor, because I think the resume is very close to Ohio State, and I'll even take it a step further. I don't know why Alabama and Oregon got a pass. I think there's perception, and that perception may be true, but there's not enough on the field. There's really not any on the field evidence to show that the SEC is in the Pac-12 this season are better than the other conferences. Do I believe that the SEC and the Pac-12 are the 2 best conferences? 1 and 2, I do, but that's what I think based on watching the games and just based on the last few years and things not drastically changing this year. But based on the field evidence outside of the conference, there's really no evidence to show that the SEC or the Pac-12 champion should be given a pass, and that's what happened. With Oregon and Alabama, it was a foregone conclusion. If they win their championship games, they're in. They're 1-2, or however you would rank them, 2-1. I don't really buy that myself. I would have thrown all the one-loss teams together and then started to try to differentiate resumes. So when people ask me, did they get it right? I don't think the system is right. So they did as well as they possibly could within the confines of the system. There were going to be difficult choices, and we talked about this the other day, 5 conferences, 4 spots. The thing I'll ask you, Hannah, is that you made the comment about giving Oregon the nod over Florida State, a one-loss Oregon team. How about a one-loss Alabama team? And I know it seems like the consensus out there that Alabama's the best team. I don't buy the best team argument because I don't think we can know that they're the best team. Do I expect them to win the national championship? Yeah, I would not be shocked in any way. But so you would rank Florida State ahead of Oregon, but not ahead of Alabama.
No, Alabama, I want to give them, obviously I think they're the best team, but I want to give them the most improved award as well. They started off the season against West Virginia. They were a bit of a mess. Blake Sims was not confident in the pocket. It wasn't a good game at all. I watched it from the sidelines. But now you have this team that's completely grounded. Like we talked about last week, Blake Sims in Tuscaloosa is very consistent. Nick Saban is very confident in this team. I don't know if you saw the interview right after they announced that he was #1. He said this has been one of the best teams he's been able to coach ever, and I think that's the growth, and I think that's the talent. It could be coach speak, but I've never heard him say anything like that about a team. So he has a lot of confidence, and you know what? If you have a coach like Nick Saban who's confident in you, I mean, you can do anything, and it seems like they've put a lot of confidence in Sims, in the team. So I like what Alabama has done, and I like the wins that they've gotten. I would put FSU over Oregon because Florida State seems to pull out these crazy wins. And I personally think they will do it again they're playing in the Rose Bowl. So if it was between Oregon, FSU in the Rose Bowl, like I said, I would put FSU over Oregon, but it wouldn't matter. They still play each other. So we'll find out on January 1st. But I put FSU winning that game because of they keep pulling out these insane wins, whether it's over Georgia Tech, and I'm not comparing Georgia Tech to Oregon at all. They're completely different teams. But FSU Winston keeps saving the day. They keep pulling out these crazy wins. I think they'll do it again over Oregon. But I like Alabama at #1. Yeah, they're one loss. But they just have so much momentum right now, especially in the SEC, especially around college football. And I'm personally excited that the conference has a team in the college football playoff because that almost wasn't the case. But like you said, we all predicted it. It was going to be a bloodbath in Atlanta over Mizzou, and it was.
Yeah, if we were going to argue who's got the most momentum coming down the stretch and who's playing the best football, then Ohio State could be #1.
True, but
#1.
True, they have a lot of momentum coming off of that Big Ten championship over number 13 Wisconsin. But if you look at it again, a lot of people still believe that Baylor should be in that #4 spot. If you look at the AP poll, they're there. Ohio State might need to thank them for not having a Big 12 championship. And, that's not necessarily the conference's fault. Isn't there an NCAA rule where you have to have 12 teams divided into 6 in order to have a conference championship, so they have these 2 co-champions? What if the Big 12 did have a conference championship? Say Baylor beat TCU. Who do you pick? Do you pick Ohio State or do you pick Baylor?
Okay, so here's the deal with me. I've got a few lessons for the Big 12, and you just mentioned one. As I understand it, I've always understood since the Big 12 was rated to a certain extent, certain teams, Nebraska leaving, Colorado leaving, a few other teams left, and then they had to, of course, to the SEC with Texas A&M and Mizzou, then they had to add on just to get back to 10 and save their conference, that they were, stripped of the conference championship game. So the Big 12 had been playing conference championship games since back in the mid-'90s. They no longer can. The NCAA rule, the better clarification I received this weekend is, yes, they removed the championship game. The Big 12 can request a waiver. Why that process is in place, I have no idea. But the Big 12 can request a waiver to get the conference championship game back. even before this situation, I would think that they would want to, because these have become so lucrative for these conferences, especially the SEC and now the Big Ten really are the marquee championship games. The Pac-12 and the ACC, we see the crowds, people still not getting to the games. But for the Big 12, yeah, my lesson would be, yeah, put in that request. You need a championship game, because regardless of how well you schedule that last game against the SEC championship game, against the Big Ten championship game, people are just, you put that mantra of championship game, that title on the game, and people are just, they know that that is the championship game of the conference, rather than, oh, well, we're playing a really good game, the last game of the season, and this is our championship. So lesson to the Big 12 is, get a championship game. And when I say that there's a request out there, I don't know if the NCAA pretty much just stamp approvals that and sends it on, or if that's going to be a big ordeal. The other thing would be Baylor. I feel bad for Baylor. They, to a certain extent, won the championship outright because they won the head-to-head. But schedule somebody. They scheduled no one non-conference, so they've got themselves to blame. If they had a marquee win over what Oregon scheduled outside of conference with Michigan State or something like that, or not even close to that, but somebody good outside of the conference, Baylor just scheduled no one. I think TCU lucked out to a certain extent with Minnesota, because when they scheduled that game, I think that was several years ago, that Minnesota wasn't quite as good as they turned out to be, so they got a good win outside of the conference. And then the other lesson I have for the Big 12 is stand your ground late in the season. So the Big 12 kind of waffled in terms of what their procedure was in deciding a champion. They didn't come out. I think they were trying to predict or hedge their bets to try to get both teams considered. So they wanted both teams to be in the running, because they didn't know which way the committee was going to go. TCU was ranked higher, but is Baylor going to catch them and surpass them because they beat them? So the Big 12 didn't want to come out and say, this is how we determine our champion. This is going to be our champion if things hold serve the rest of the season. They were constantly like, well, we got co-champions, we share champions. Sometimes they said, well, we might break the tie. They have procedures in place. I just think they waffled because they wanted to play their cards right for the College Football Playoff Committee. So stand your ground, set out your procedures. This is our champion. Get a championship game if you possibly can. And again, everybody needs to schedule somebody outside of conference. I threw it out on Twitter that every team in the Big 12 scheduled somebody pretty good outside of conference, except for Baylor. They were the only team that scheduled nobody, and it really hurt them in the end.
Yeah, it clearly hurt them in the end, and it hurt the Big 12 in the end. Like you were saying, they were just kind of waiting on the committee. But, you know, the commissioner, they didn't pick an outright winner, so look what happened. And do I believe if they had the Big 12 championship and Baylor beat TCSU? In my opinion, I think that Baylor is number 4. But these are the best 4 teams in the country going to be playing each other. My prediction is Alabama and FSU in the national championship, and that just shows how good FSU is. Again, coming off a national championship, it's nearly impossible to head back to that game again. And then it shows the state of Alabama football is an absolute force to be reckoned with, and it has been for the past decade, it seems like. So I think Alabama FSU, I'm not sure that people want to see that matchup. I know Seminole fans want to, because they've been so underrated. They're undefeated, the only undefeated team in the FBS, and yet, you know, they're sitting there number 3 behind Oregon. So Oregon FSU, I definitely think is going to be a better matchup than Alabama Ohio State, in my opinion. I think FSU pulls it out again. They've been doing it all season, and that is so tough. I mean, that is such a tough thing to do, to go undefeated and keep pulling out these crazy wins. And I think they find a way to do it again over the Ducks. I definitely think Alabama beats Ohio State, and I think Alabama wins the national championship, not just because I'm covering the SEC, just because of what I've seen them do this season, especially in the passing game. We've never seen that. Alabama's been traditionally dominant on defense and dominant on the run game with a stellar quarterback like running back like Eddie Lacy. They've been okay at passing. You had A.J. McCarron back there who could throw down the field when he needed to, make big plays when he needed to, but now, we've got the new offensive coordinator in there. They're changing it up, a lot more passing game, especially with confidence in Blake Sims. So I think Alabama ultimately wins it all over FSU. What do you think?
Well, I think that I think Alabama throws it more because, as you mentioned, Lane Kiffin loves to throw it, and I think there's been times this season when they've struggled throwing the ball a little bit, and Nick Saban wants to get back to the ground game and fundamental Alabama football. I also think that T.J. Yeldon's been a bit banged up with some ankle injuries, and he hasn't been 100%, and that's Alabama's bread and butter, as you mentioned. But the passing game's been dynamic, and Blake Sims brings a component to the passing game that A.J. McCarron didn't, and even Greg McElroy, who won a national championship before McCarron, and that's that those guys were pocket passers. They could move around a little bit, move around within the pocket, but they weren't going to scare or challenge a defense downfield if the defensive line lost containment. And Blake Sims, this is what makes the Alabama offense so very difficult to contain and deal with, and we saw 55 put on the board against Auburn, and Auburn's not great on defense, but still it's an SEC defense. So Urban Meyer's going to be in the film room constantly for the next 3 weeks trying to deal with that, because best receiver in college football, extraordinary running game, physical offensive line, T.J. Yeldon, Derrick Henry, who comes in and looks like Eric Dickerson, and then Blake Sims, who's not turned into just a pretty polished passer, but also a guy that if you don't account for him and keep your lanes is going to take off and run for 12 or 15 yards. So it's difficult to defend. No doubt we've seen it down the stretch of the season when this offense has really come together. My thoughts on the semifinals. I haven't really made a prediction. Don't hold me to this, Hannah. This is not the official prediction. I think Ohio State has two big issues. And number one, it's that I don't necessarily know that SEC fans pay a whole lot of attention or would know, but this Ohio State roster's extremely young. They have a bunch of freshmen and sophomores running around out there. So they lost 4 NFL offensive linemen last year. They, of course, have lost their 2 quarterbacks, and I'll get to that in a second, but sophomore running back, and he's doing a great job, over 1,000 yards. But their defense is just, their secondary, even their best player on defense, Joey Bosa, who might be the best defensive end in the country, is a sophomore. They are just loaded with freshmen and sophomore. Their most dynamic receiver is a freshman, Jalen Marshall, who returns kicks. So they might not be quite ready for this stage. I think that they were actually thinking 2015, 2016, they're going to be dominant. But they're there, and they've got tons of talent, but they are so young. And then the quarterback situation, for as good as Cardell Jones looked against Wisconsin, he never had to face adversity. He was never in a situation where he had to lead a game-winning drive, or Wisconsin is a very formidable defense, but it's not Alabama. It doesn't have the speed and athleticism of Alabama. So to put a third-string quarterback out there that's played one game, he's got one game under his belt, and now he faces Alabama, I think that's a lot to ask. Wow, that Florida State-Oregon game, I don't know what to tell you, Hannah, because everything logically tells me that Oregon should win this game. I think Mariota's playing better than Winston, not necessarily that he's more talented, but he's playing much better than Winston. And Oregon's got it going. They're rolling against really good teams. Florida State slips by, makes the right play, gets a lucky bounce. Whatever happens has to happen, and they get it to happen. But I'm kind of with you that this team just seems to be able to gather itself and make the right plays in the right situations. And they're loaded. They lost a ton to the NFL last year, but those recruiting classes have been so good. And I think that Florida State is that nice blend of speed and athleticism versus strength and muscle. And this is where Alabama probably separates itself, is that if they would play in Oregon, I just think they're just going to beat them up. And I think Florida State can do that to a degree. I think they're more physical than Oregon, and they might just beat up Oregon up front with NFL quality offensive and defensive linemen, that they'll just wear them down. And Florida State can play finesse because they've got the athletes, but they can also just pound it with Cook between the tackles, and I don't know if Oregon can contend with that. So unofficial prediction there, Alabama, Florida State. I'm right there with you, Hannah. But
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, both teams are loaded, and without getting too deep into stats and everything like that, FSU just keeps pulling it out. And I don't think it's going to be any different against Oregon. Yeah, these are two great teams. Oregon has a lot of momentum, but I think FSU's been underrated in some of these rankings coming down the backstretch of the season, and I think they pull it out again. They just keep, whether it's luck, whether it's talent, whether it's Jimbo Fisher genius, they keep pulling it out, and I think they're going to do it again versus Oregon. But I think it's a much better matchup right now than Oregon-Alabama. I just see Alabama kind of just dominating Oregon, especially in the run game there. Alabama defense has been really stout, especially down the back stretch of this season. So I don't know. That's my official prediction. Yours is unofficial.
Unofficial. I don't make predictions.
Mine's official.
Until like 24 hours before. Those are my official predictions.
Yeah.
I think I tweet something out like 30 seconds to kick when the kicker's in motion, ready to boot it in the air. I'll send something out to let you know what the last prediction is, the one that really counts.
Well,
So,
I'll look for that on Twitter.
There you go. Hannah, before I let you go, you're an Ole Miss girl, so you wanted that Baylor game. You got TCU, so they got close for you. They stayed in Texas. They stayed in the conference. They stayed with the other team there. So Ole Miss and TCU, that should be a really good game.
I did want that Baylor matchup. I wanted that Baylor matchup so bad. Baylor offense versus Ole Miss defense, I thought it was going to be a great one. But TCU's not bad either. Ole Miss fans are excited about it. Number 6 team in the country. You know, it's one of the 6 bowl games around the country, and I think it's going to be a great matchup in Atlanta, Chick-fil-A Bowl. I got a media pass. Well, I haven't been approved yet, but I sent it in yesterday. Surely that'll be coming back soon with the stamp of approval for that game. So maybe we can come back on after New Year's Eve and tell you what I saw at that matchup.
That is very cool, Hannah. Thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. Hannah Chalker on the SEC Fans Radio Network has a show each and every week. And also, Hannah, what's the name of your show? I'm sorry.
It's called SEC Fans Insider, and right now it's running Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Central on SECFansRadioNetwork.com and syndicated across the Southeast. So it's a lot of fun. We basically just, Dr. SEC and I just go back and forth with our thoughts. We bring in guests just like your show here, Mark, and it's just a lot of fun. It's just a lot of relaxed football talk and our opinions and what we think is going to happen. So
you're a brave girl doing a show with Dr. SEC. You try to keep him in line.
I try. We disagree a lot, but it usually comes back and bites him. I'm usually right.
Of course you are. It's Dr. SEC. He says he's the doctor, but we know better. So my money's on you each and every time. So that's what makes it fun too. You got to debate this stuff, but not take it too seriously. But it is a good time. So, Hannah, thanks so much for joining us. We'll catch you soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Hannah Chalker covered Mercer football for ESPN3 most recently, and also, yes, as she mentions there, with Dr. SEC on the SEC Fans Radio Network, where you can catch us as well, 2 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Central, each and every weekday for the rest of the week after we get this published. So for the rest of our show, we've got Joe Lisi coming in for GoForThe2.com a little bit later in the hour. We also have Stephen M. Smith standing by. We're waiting for Stephen M. to come on the line, touchdownalabama.net. Want to remind you that you catch us on Google Hangouts each and every Monday live. So if you want to catch us live and see our beautiful faces, or at least my guests' beautiful faces, I will not vouch for myself, but I do have the Christmas tree here. So there's an added bonus to watching the video either live or on YouTube after the fact. So Monday afternoon, available on YouTube, the SEC in 60 at Mark Rogers TV, and also at my website, markrogerstv.com. That admittedly needs a lot of work, but there are videos there. So the content's really good. It doesn't look great, people, but the content we think is really good as we get on some of the best bloggers across the country. If you look at the lineup of bloggers and broadcasters and writers that we regularly have on our show, and on our segments on YouTube and at my website, markrogerstv.com, then it's pretty impressive. People from SB Nation, Bleacher Report, on down the line from all over the place, 24/7 Sports. We get some of the best, and they bring insight into the SEC and really the entire nation. We go national on Mark Rogers TV. This is our SEC in 60 show each and every Monday. So we're waiting for Stephen M. Smith. I'm going to let you know what I think about this whole deal with the college football rankings. I've got Florida State 1. No, I don't think they're the best team in the country, nor have they played like the best team in the country. They are undefeated against a quality schedule. Make fun of the ACC, fine. If you match up the ACC out of conference results with the SEC in particular, they're better or just as good. And I'm not even talking about those 4 games on the final weekend where the ACC won 4 straight, because those were not comparable matchups. I'm talking about overall. I listed out the ACC wins out of conference and losses, and the SEC wins and losses out of conference. I showed them to a few people and said, which conference played better out of conference? Nobody could tell me because it's indistinguishable. So Florida State's my number 1. They're undefeated. Again, not the best team, but they're number 1 in my book. Oregon 2, Alabama 3. I differentiate Oregon based on Pac-12 being roughly as good as the SEC, and Michigan State being the best non-conference win out there. Ohio State at 4, and again, I feel horrible for Baylor and TCU. They won a conference in some fashion, but it's a lesson to the Big 12, and it's a lesson to Baylor in particular that you got to schedule non-conference, and you need to establish a championship game, get that waiver from the NCAA, get that championship game in place, because regardless of how you backload the schedule to the last week of the season, a Kansas State-Baylor game got little buzz this week because it wasn't the SEC championship game or the Pac-12 or the Big Ten championship game. You throw a championship game when people know these are the 2 teams that have won their way and earned their way to a conference championship, and we've seen what the SEC has kind of birthed in these championship games, and now it's spread mostly to the Big Ten. The ACC and the Pac-12 still trying to establish their championship games, even though the Big Ten's newer than the ACC. A lot more fans there, a lot more eyeballs on the TV sets because of the strength of the conference nationally in regards to prestige and size of fan bases with Ohio State, Michigan, and on down the line. But we bring on Stephen M. Smith of TouchdownAlabama.net. I've been waiting for this conversation because Alabama has weathered all the storms, the adversity, some issues at quarterback back in August in regards to who's the guy going to be. Wasn't clear-cut until late in training camp that Blake Sims had won the job. Defensive issues in the secondary at times that were exposed. No team's perfect. I think sometimes, especially when it's in Alabama, we expect perfection. And Nick Saban so many times let us know during the season that he was proud of this team. Not happy with the mistakes and the penalties and the miscues, but proud of the way the team rallied and the unselfishness of this team. And I believe that he knew down deep that good things were going to happen. And even with a loss to Ole Miss on the road, the team came back, and here we see most likely the best team in the country. So we go to Stephen M. Smith of TouchdownAlabama.net. Stephen M., how are you?
Doing well, Mark, and yourself?
I'm doing great. So we have been waiting for so long to get, not to get through the season, because we as college football fans, there's almost a mourning once the season's over to think, yeah, we love bowl season, and this is some of my favorite games and time of the year. Even though some of these games we consider meaningless, I love watching the bowl games. Love the bowl games. Even the 6-6 teams out there, I'm going to be watching as much bowl action as possible. But this is what we've been waiting for in terms of college football rankings, and as it pertained to Alabama, of course, and even the rest of the SEC, there wasn't going to be a second team in the mix, despite a really great season out of Mississippi State. It just didn't line up that way. Just your thoughts about, before we spin this forward, the Missouri championship game and Alabama's performance against an overmatched opponent, but there was still possibility, based on Mizzou playing much better football, that that they would put up a fight, and it was 21-13 close to the fourth quarter, so there was a little bit of fight out of Missouri. So your evaluation of Alabama's performance?
I thought the team competed, Mark. I felt like give Missouri a lot of credit. Matty Mark a lot more elusive than what I thought he would be, being able to kind of pull some Johnny Manziel plays out of his hat, being able to scramble and find open receivers deep down the field. Jimmy Hunt came up big for Matty Mark on a lot of those catches. Bud Sasser didn't have the best game, but he came out and performed well. He had a touchdown reception. But you got to give Alabama's defensive line a lot of credit. DJ Petway, Aishawn Robinson, Xavier Dixon, Jaron Reed, those guys really stopped the run. Alabama's secondary played well in run support. Could have done a lot better in coverage, but as I mentioned, Missouri's only offense was scramble and put up a prayer. And sometimes that's the best offense to have because it was working for Missouri. Offensively for Alabama, Blake Sims, outstanding job. 85.2% of those passes completed, set an SEC title game record. Took a shot to the helmet from Missouri Shane Ray, but still delivered a 58-yard touchdown to DeAndre White. What more can you say about Amari Cooper? He had a big game, 10 catches, 83 yards. He really opened up DeAndre White and Christian Jones, who both played well. Didn't see a lot of TJ Yeldon, but Derrick Henry, the man-child, Derrick Henry, 141 yards rushing, 2 touchdowns. It was a balanced performance offensively from Alabama. Defensively, it was bend but don't break, but going back to what I said about Missouri, their offense was just throw the ball up there and pray somebody comes down with it, and more times than not it did work.
Stephen M., what do you expect out of this running back situation? You alluded to what happened in the championship game with Derrick Henry, and wow, every time this kid gets the ball, he's just physically dominant. We saw it against Oklahoma last year in the Sugar Bowl, most notably on a big stage, and then again we saw it on Saturday. TJ Yeldon, I don't think he's quite himself. I think that's pretty obvious. He's not quite himself, but I think he's really hurting. How do you assess how they're going to treat the carries coming into the Sugar Bowl?
I think they're still going to be pretty balanced. I mean, TJ Yeldon, you didn't see a lot of him in the second half because he's still kind of nursing the ankle foot injury. He did have 2 rushing touchdowns in the game, which put him 3rd all time in Alabama history behind behind Mark Ingram and Sean Alexander. But you saw more of Derrick Henry because Henry was able to have some success, especially between the tackles against Missouri, and also his ability to bounce the ball to the outside and make plays happen on the edge. I even look at freshman running back Tyron Jones, who only had 3 carries for 26 yards, but he averaged 8.7 yards per carry. He was able to rip off some good runs to his own credit. So the carries, I believe, still would be balanced between TJ Yeldon and Derrick Henry. Alabama does get a little break before they really start preparing for Ohio State, so more rest for Yeldon. The carries will be balanced, but I still see more of Derrick Henry in the second half because of his ability to not only just power people over, but he's got the speed. He's worked on the patience. He has that down. And also, don't be surprised if you see freshman Tyron Jones get a couple of carries in the mix because he's really come on strong as of late for Saban and company.
Hey, Stephen M., we're going to dive so much more into this matchup in the coming weeks. Of course, we've got almost a month before Ohio State, Alabama. I would like for you to educate myself to a certain extent, although I think I know the Alabama depth chart at wide receiver fairly well. I think there are a lot of people out there, and watching the national shows, it's all Amari Cooper, Amari Cooper. I hear analysts on there talking about, take away Cooper, you're good to go. That's all you need to do is just bracket him, take care of Amari Cooper. That's what Ohio State needs to do. Auburn matched up one-on-one, and they got burned, and even if they got safety help, they didn't get enough attention to Amari Cooper, and you should be okay because the next guy's got 37 receptions. Educate us on the talented wide receiver for Alabama other than Amari Cooper, because we all know about the Heisman Trophy candidate.
Well, Amari Cooper is the Heisman Trophy candidate, but if you ask me, the savviest route runner on this team is DeAndre White. the senior DeAndre White. I mean, he hasn't played much this season. He's been a little banged up, but DeAndre White is a guy that can take the top off of defense. He's a great route runner, a tremendous balance, good hands. He had a huge game against Missouri, 4 catches, 101 yards, and a touchdown. His last 100-yard receiving performance came in the 2014 Sugar Bowl against Oklahoma. In that matchup, DeAndre White, 3 catches, 139 yards, and a touchdown. So DeAndre White, a very capable receiver, especially when he is healthy. Against LSU, DeAndre White had 3 catches in that game. We had 6 catches, in that game, especially 3 on the Tide's final drive, and 2 on the Tide's final drive, and 1 in Alabama's overtime possession that resulted in a 6-yard game-winning touchdown pass from Blake Sims. So DeAndre White's a playmaker. Christian Jones, who hasn't been targeted much this season, is also another playmaker, and Christian Jones became pivotal in the championship game against Missouri for Alabama, especially in the second half where Amari Cooper wasn't targeted much. I mean, he only had 2 catches in the second half despite 12 of the game. 10 of Amari Cooper's 12 catches came in the first half. So Missouri did a better job of defending him in the second half, and that's where Christian Jones came alive. Christian Jones, 3 catches for 40 yards and a touchdown in the second half. You look at O.J. Howard, who has become more of a blocker this year versus being a receiver, but still just a freak athlete in the middle of the field. O.J. Howard, a very capable pass-catching tight end. You look at Ardarius Stewart, who's a freshman this season, but already he's as fluid as a runner as Amari Cooper is. Ardarius Stewart just doesn't have the catches or the yards, but just talent-wise, he's just as fluid as a runner as Amari Cooper. You look at Chris Black, who's a very solid receiver, or Robert Foster, who's starting to come on. You look at Cam Sims, who caught his first collegiate touchdown as a freshman for Alabama this season against Western Carolina. So this Alabama team is stacked at receiver. Cooper gets the most attention because the Lane Kiffin offensive play calling is keyed in on getting your playmakers the ball, but this Alabama offense is littered with wide receivers.
Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com standing by. Stephen M., before we let you go, how much have you seen Ohio State, any of the Big Ten championship game or anything earlier? It's a unique situation in which we've got a quarterback who's thrown, I know he threw some passes against Illinois in a blowout, but basically threw 17 passes in well, it wasn't even competitive for that long, but you know what I mean, 17 passes in a game that really meant something the other day, so very much an unknown commodity. But we'll dig more into the Buckeyes in the coming weeks. But right now, any thoughts about Ohio State and what could be a matchup?
They're a good football team. Cardale Jones, a very mobile quarterback, a guy that's not afraid of the big moment. He's a young guy, Ohio State's third-string quarterback, but like I said, Cardale Jones, not afraid of the big moment, as we saw against Wisconsin, took it upon himself to really lead the team and guide the team to a 59-0 shutout. But the thing that I like about Ohio State is their run game. Ezekiel Elliott is a speedster. He's a guy that reminds me a lot of Missouri's Marcus Murphy, a guy that can bounce to the outside and get the yards on the ground, especially on the edge. He can run in between the tackles. He's very protective of the football. He's a tough runner. Devin Smith is a receiver that can high point the football and go get it. I love his ability as a vertical threat down the field. Ohio State on the defensive line has a guy in Joey Bosa that is a technique defensive lineman. He can bull rush, he can spin rush, he can create leverage, a guy that is keen on stopping the run. And that's going to be the most intense matchup between Joey Bosa and freshman offensive tackle for Alabama, Cam Robinson. That is going to be the matchup to watch. Freshman on Joey Bosa. How much can Cam Robinson be able to handle him and keep him bottled up and keeping Blake Sims off the ground and also establishing the run game, because Alabama loves to run to the left side where Cam Robinson lies. So Robinson on Joey Bosa will be a good matchup. But Urban Meyer, one of the best minds in college football. Cardale Jones, young guy, not afraid of the big moment. Ohio State can run the football. It should be a good game.
Been doing your homework on the Buckeyes. Very nice, Stephen M. I like that. The one concern, well, I have many concerns for the Buckeyes. The one in mentioning Ezekiel Elliott is that a lot of these elite programs come at you with waves of running backs. Yeah, they got their starter, but Ezekiel Elliott carrying everything for the Buckeyes. The number 2 guy, Curtis Samuel's just a freshman, and he's a great talent. We'll see him in the future years, but right now it's Elliott or bust. It's almost like Carlos Hyde last year. And, of course, that worked out pretty well for Ohio State. Hyde's earning a paycheck right now with San Francisco. But they really rely, I think Urban Meyer, even though he's got talented backups that are probably just as talented, he loves that continuity because he wants there to be that chemistry between quarterback and running back in that read option play, and so that they have that chemistry of not confusing the give or the take between quarterback, running back, and he likes to stay with one guy. So Elliott's going to be the guy, and he better stay fresh because, in the fourth quarter, he's going to, if Ohio State gets their way and gets a challenging game, he's going to get 20 or 22 carries, something like that. So it's not exactly running back by committee at Ohio State. So, Stephen M., we appreciate the time. Of course, we're going to talk so much more about Bama, Ohio State in the coming weeks. And if you love traditional matchups, we somewhat get it in the Final Four, although Oregon, of course, new to the scene when it comes to elite programs. But the other 3, about as much star power as you can get in name brand when you talk about this one in particular, Ohio State and Alabama in the Sugar Bowl. Stephen M., you have yourself a great day. I always appreciate it, man.
No problem, Mark. Thank you guys for having me on.
Definitely. And we will talk soon. All right, there are other teams in the SEC playing bowl games. Postseason plays all over the place for the SEC. This is a conference that beat up on a lot of bad teams outside of the conference, with 45 of 56 non-conference games being non-Power 5 matchups. You know how I feel about that, and what that turns into is a lot of wins, and what that turns into is a lot of bowl-eligible teams. And for the SEC, that means 12 bowl-eligible in 14 teams. And we bring in Joe Lisi at GoForThe2.com to talk it up. Joe, how are you today? I asked that pretty much knowing how you're doing today. Joe, very much under the weather, still joins us, and I tried to talk him out of it. Not that I didn't want him on, but Joe, taking one for the team here.
I appreciate it, Mark. Anytime to talk college football with you, always appreciative.
I don't want to dive seriously heavy into Alabama, Ohio State. We'll do that in future weeks. But your overview of what first came to mind when this matchup was presented?
I think it's right that Ohio State deserves the 4th spot in the playoff committee. Their dominating performance over Wisconsin on Saturday in the Big Ten championship game, in my opinion, the right pick to have the Buckeyes play Alabama. So I think it's an interesting matchup. Ohio State's defense going up against Alabama's offense. How it plays out, we'll break it down over the next couple of weeks. But it should be a very interesting matchup, Mark.
Got all these other matchups, 11 other SEC teams making bowl games. What matchups? I know you're going to be watching all these games, so that's not going to be the question, but it's going to be the question of what really gets you juiced up in looking at these other SEC matchups.
They all get me juiced up. There's a few that really stand out for me. Miami, South Carolina is a very interesting matchup. Duke Johnson going up against that Gamecock defense that gave up in back-to-back games against Tennessee and Auburn over 300 rushing yards of defense. So I'm curious to see how the Hurricanes respond. Should be a very interesting matchup. A suspect Gamecock defense going up against a high, potent offensive attack in Miami with Philip Dorsett, Duke Johnson, and Brad Kaya. Should be a very interesting matchup. I want to see how that plays out. And then the other matchup that is really just jumps out off the page is TCU Ole Miss. Ole Miss's defensive front led by Kamdichi going up against Trev Boykin in that offense. TCU probably very angry to be knocked out by the Buckeyes. How will they respond in this game? You have to remember, Ole Miss played in this game, in the stadium to start the year against Boise State. They dominated the Broncos late in the second half. They played there before, but this is a statement game in my opinion, because Ole Miss, for much of the year was considered as one of those teams as a top 4 selection till they lost on the road against LSU. They knocked off Mississippi State in the Egg Bowl in dominating fashion. Now they have to play TCU that just got knocked out of the playoff. Which team is focused and which team responds? Curious to see how it plays out. And then one game that really jumps out for me in terms of a mismatch, Mississippi State, Georgia Tech. It's a very interesting matchup because you have the triple option for the Yellow Jackets going up against the Mississippi State Bulldogs defensive front that is very solid in run support, only giving up about 100 rushing yards per game. They're going to have all month to prepare for this game. They should have a read on the Georgia Tech timing and Georgia Tech offense, and the way you beat Mississippi State is to challenge that secondary and to throw over the top. And without Smelter, their big play wide receiver, are they going to be able to have that success? I'm not so sure. I really, in my opinion, that's the one game I think is a real mismatch, is the Mississippi State Bulldogs Georgia Tech game. I think Mississippi State dominates that game.
Totally agree, Joe. That one hit me as well because on the surface, great matchup. You got the ACC second place team against Mississippi State. They both 10-2 in the regular season. Georgia Tech really challenged Florida State. But yeah, a month to prepare with the front 7 of Mississippi State, a whole month to get disciplined, get the technique down, get the look. You watch the scout team day after day after day, study film. I just think Mississippi State's going to show themselves to be far superior with that matchup with Georgia Tech. And you mentioned DeAndre Smelter, 32 receptions doesn't sound like a ton, but in this pass offense, he was the go-to guy. 7 touchdowns, made all the big plays in the passing game for Georgia Tech, and they really missed him against Florida State. May have pulled off the upset with Smelter in the lineup. Ole Miss TCU, that goes without saying. Wow, that's just crazy good right there. And always love seeing what happens with the SEC against the Big Ten. The Big Ten puts up a fight. Typically, we got Missouri, Minnesota, Auburn, Wisconsin, Tennessee, Iowa on New Year's Day and January 2nd. SEC and the Big Ten. Anything stand out for you there?
Well, Tennessee, Iowa. Tennessee back to a bowl game. They're very excited. They have a very dynamic quarterback in Joshua Dobbs. Iowa, more methodical, solid defensive front. Probably would have been in a better bowl game if they would have knocked off Nebraska at the end of the year. But this is a solid matchup for the Tennessee Volunteers. And Butch Jones really has this team buying into the system. So Tennessee back in a bowl game. Interesting with that matchup. And another matchup that we've seen throughout the years, Auburn and Wisconsin. We've seen it a couple of times. They played earlier in the decade. I think when Kenny Irons and Ronnie Brown were there and Cadillac Williams, they faced off against the Badgers. That was a tough matchup. I think it was the Music City Bowl back in the day, but they played a couple of times. It's another interesting matchup. Nick Marshall, dynamic quarterback. You saw the speed that affected the Wisconsin Badgers from Ohio State this weekend. How will they basically go up against one of the most dynamic offenses in the SEC and Gus Malzahn and the Auburn Tigers? That, to me, is a mismatch, but they do have all month to prepare for that ball game, so we'll see how that plays out. Another game that really jumped out for me that I forgot to mention was Louisville and Georgia, Mark. Very interesting matchup because Bobby Petrino, who used to be the coach at Arkansas, now going back up against Mark Richt, a very interesting matchup. And defensive coordinator Todd Grantham for the Louisville Cardinals was the defensive coordinator last year for Georgia. He was an embattled coordinator for the team. Georgia fans disliked him heavily. He did lead that Louisville Cardinal defense to, at one point, statistically tops in the nation. They're solid. They have some playmakers on the offensive side of the ball, and Eli Rogers and Devontae Parker at the wide receiver position. Michael Dyer, the former Auburn running back, very solid and a very dynamic running back in Radcliffe. He's a kid that really can make people miss, has great speed, and they have a heavy offensive line. They're going to be going up against that Bulldog defense. Floyd Jenkins, Armando Herrera, just an interesting matchup. And then you look at the defense for Louisville going up against Nick Chubb, Hudson Mason, Chris Connolly, Malcolm Mitchell, just dynamic players on both sides of the ball. That's one game I have to watch.
For the past couple of years, Joe, the bowl lineups kind of disappointed me because I'm the type where a lot of college football fans would like to see those overachieving teams from the smaller conferences that had a 10-2 season get into a bowl game, 9-3 season, rather than a bunch of 7-5, 6-6 teams from Power 5 conferences. But I guess I'm just a Power 5 conference guy at the core and like to see the name brands match up, even if they had a down year. Like you mentioned, South Carolina, Miami, both had down years, a couple 6-6 teams. But I still want to see that game over somebody from a Sun Belt conference or somewhere else. The SEC last year had 10 games. They were mostly a heavy favorite across the board, but they were favored in all 10 games. They won 7, so there were SEC fans talking about winning every game, but they won 7 of 10. I look at these games, and I expect the SEC to win the majority of these 12, but I don't know that it's going to be much better than 7 or 8 wins because I see some losses in here. I think aside from Alabama's going to be a decided favorite against Ohio State. I haven't seen the lines on any of these games, but I would expect that to be a 10 or 12-point line. Mississippi State, maybe the line won't be big, but based on the information you gave us and what we talked about with Georgia Tech, I just think it's a bad matchup for the Yellow Jackets. I expect that to be an SEC win. But other than that, I think you got a lot of toss-ups. Arkansas, Texas, that's one that could be really fun to watch.
That brings back the old days of the Southwest Conference, doesn't it? When Barry Foster and Quinn Grovey roamed the sidelines in Fayetteville, going back to the old days of Peter Gardere and Butch Hadnot. But that is a very interesting matchup as well. The game's taking place in Houston, so they should have a huge turnout for that game. You're talking about an upstart Arkansas team going up against a solid defensive front by the Texas Longhorns, led by a defensive coach in Charlie Strong. We saw what he did a couple of years ago with knocking off the Florida Gators in the Sugar Bowl. So now you're going to give them all month to prepare for a solid Arkansas offense, but it's not by no means dominant in terms of best in the country. They're predominantly run-heavy offense. They're going to challenge that defensive front for Texas. But this was a Texas defensive front entering the TCU game that had 37 sacks on the year, only gave up about 186 passing yards per game. They're very solid in the secondary, can play man-to-man coverage, which allows Charlie Strong to blitz his linebackers. They were able, Mark, to get pressure on Trev Boykin in that game. The thing that led them down was they committed 6 turnovers, which led to points, and that Texas offense isn't built to come from behind. But straight up, Texas defensive front going up against the O-line of Arkansas, very interesting matchup. It's going to be a smash-mouth type of football game, blue-collar. Look for a low-scoring game, in my opinion.
Exactly. Those teams are going to beat up on each other. Arkansas, downhill running. Texas, very strong defensively, as you mentioned. And I don't expect either one of those teams to run away from the other team. And if you're just looking for a name matchup, or for a couple of programs that are a bit down this year, I don't know that we've had a Music City Bowl that gives you the cachet of LSU and Notre Dame, and the Irish just have looked horrible over the second half of the season. And it's interesting to see in previous years, sometimes you see a team come in with a ton of momentum, playing extremely well coming into the bowl game, but that 4 weeks off, 5 weeks off, and all of a sudden they're a different team. That's the unknown factor, the X factor in these bowl games. It's incentive, it's preparation, it's how much, like in the case of Georgia Tech and Mississippi State, does one team have a big advantage because of the preparation time against a unfamiliar type scheme, that they get a chance to even out the advantage that team had week to week because teams only had 5 or 6 days to prepare for them. So with LSU Notre Dame, who knows? Notre Dame, I expect them to get – I don't think LSU has the offensive firepower to trounce them, but to control the game. But because Notre Dame's looked like garbage for 6 weeks, but maybe Notre Dame gets its act together and shows some pride and comes out with a nice effort.
Well, this is a rematch of the old Independence Bowls when Kevin Falk, Rondell Mealy, and Cecil Collins played up against Notre Dame. They played earlier. I believe the year was 1997, the 1997 Independence Bowl. That's when LSU broke out those retro uniforms to play the Irish. They played earlier in the year, just a dominant effort at home in the state of Louisiana. But you're right, Mark. This is a very interesting matchup. You have a very young team in LSU, and what I mean young offensively at the quarterback position, Anthony Jennings, Brandon Harris, whoever decides to go for this game, Leonard Fournette, the freshman phenom that broke onto the scene in the SEC, and Malachi Dupree, the big play wide receiver who really came on down the stretch for the LSU Tigers. So this team, a methodical season, not like many had hoped, but they lost so much offensive production that this is their first bowl game, so they'll probably be excited to play in this matchup. This is an interesting matchup. It's a well-known team in Notre Dame, so I expect LSU and Les Miles always has his teams ready to play. Look for LSU to be inspired in this game. But I also feel like Notre Dame will be in this matchup as well. Now, I haven't had a chance to break it down and see who will win this game, but I have some feelings about what I expect from Notre Dame. When you lose so many games down the stretch like Notre Dame has and really got embarrassed, they got embarrassed on the defensive front. They were out in terms of in my opinion, out game planned in much of their games down the stretch against Northwestern, USC, and Louisville. The speed of those teams really gave the Notre Dame defense some problems. Now this is a chance to regroup. There's a chance to forget about what the last month of the season had for this team, a chance to regroup, get back on track, and they're going up against an SEC opponent in LSU. So this is where, when you say which team will respond, well, Notre Dame has an opportunity to really throw away their past month of performance and really concentrate on the LSU Tigers that, in my opinion, have problems stretching defenses vertically. So look for Notre Dame to be in this game. Who wins? I'm not saying yet because I haven't had an opportunity to break it down and really delve into the numbers and see some game film. But just off the top of my head, this is an interesting matchup.
Joe's taking one for the team. Joe Lisi, goforthe2.com. So we're not going to push you anymore, Joe, with any previews. But Joe and I could talk old bowl matchups. We're children of the 80s, so we could talk about old bowl matchups. And I was just scanning this list. Mississippi State, Georgia Tech, they played a couple home-and-home games around 2005, 2006. I believe the Yellow Jackets took both of those. Ole Miss-TCU, no history comes to mind there. Missouri, Minnesota. Of course, that was once a Big Ten, Big 12 matchup, or would have been, but nothing comes to mind there. You mentioned Auburn, Wisconsin. Wisconsin, because of those SEC Big Ten Bowl tie-ins with what was the Capital One, and before that the Citrus, and now it's once again the Citrus, the Outback, the Gator Bowl in recent years, and in national championship games. You got a lot of crossover with the SEC and the Big Ten. And Auburn, Wisconsin. Yeah, Wisconsin's had a lot of matchups with Auburn and Georgia in particular. They split a couple of games with Georgia in the 2000s. The Auburn game, I believe, was like a 24-21 Auburn win, if I remember correctly, because I get those Georgia and Auburn matchups mixed up with Wisconsin. But the Badgers usually bring it really well against the SEC. But we'll see after that Big Ten championship performance. Do you remember this one, Joe? Tennessee, Iowa. I believe it was the 82 Peach Bowl. Tennessee and Iowa got together.
I remember the highlights of it. I was a little young at the time. I didn't catch that one live, but I remember the highlights of that one. That was impressive. I remember many of those bowl games back in 82, 83. Just an incredible year for college football. But no, that one I did not catch live on the TV, though, Mark. I've seen the highlights.
Yeah, Tennessee, Iowa. Yeah, I remember that, and I think that was pre-Chuck Long, and I would have to go back to peg the year for sure, but I'm almost sure it was 82 between those two. Louisville, Georgia, can't think of any history there. Florida, East Carolina, Arkansas, Texas, of course, back from the Southwestern games. And I go back even into the 70s with watching college football, so I pretty much date myself at 77, 78 when I really started to lock into college football. And in addition, if you remember, Houston Nutt pulled off a big upset in the Cotton Bowl against Texas as well just about 6 or 7 years ago.
with Jevon Sneed at quarterback, correct? I think that was the one when he was the Ole Miss coach, right? Houston Nutt.
So was that an Ole Miss Texas game? I thought he was with Arkansas and he pulled off a game against Texas. I'll have to backtrack.
He might have been. Now I have to think that you might be right with Arkansas with Darren McFadden and Felix Jones and Casey Dick was the quarterback. I have to remember now. Yep.
Yeah, Texas was like a double-digit favorite. Arkansas went in there and just took care of business, like 24-6, something like that. And then the year that Arkansas lost to Florida in the championship game in the SEC, they turned around and played an 11-1 Wisconsin team, and they lost the Capital One. Then they showed up against Missouri in the Cotton Bowl and got smacked around with Chase Daniel. But Texas A&M, West Virginia, really, that's a Big 12 connection of sorts. That West Virginia joins the Big 12, Texas A&M leaves. Don't think those two schools have much history. LSU, Notre Dame, you mentioned the Independents with Bob Davie on the sideline. I think that was like a 45-28 LSU win over the Irish. And again, South Carolina, Miami, nothing comes to mind. But if you go pre-92, South Carolina and Independent at that point, a lot of people listening probably don't remember those days. So you had a lot of independents running around like Penn State, Louisville, South Carolina, Miami, all sorts of independent teams that, Rutgers, Syracuse, a lot of the Eastern Bloc, and a lot of teams down south that have joined conferences since. So I'm guessing South Carolina, Miami have some history, but not in postseason play. Joe, good to talk to you. I know you're hurting today, so we'll let you go. But thanks for the time, and we've got about 3 weeks to really dive into these matchups, and of course we'll catch you on some Tuesday nights coming forward. Joe joins us on Tuesday nights to break down the college football games week to week, and we may take it a break, give it a break with the bowl games not starting until December 20th. Hey, Joe, you get some rest, and we'll talk to you later.
Sounds great, Mark. Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, Joe Lisi at goforthe2.com. That's his Twitter handle. So go to goforthe2.com. Check out his work right there. He writes some good stuff about college football, and I think you just get a glimpse of the stats, the figures, the analysis. So it's not just regurgitating stats and figures. This guy breaks it down. He understands offense, defense, played the game, and gives us some great analysis. You are watching or you're listening to the SEC in 60, and of course the added bonus of watching the SEC in 60 these days is that you get to see the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree becomes the star in the background, so I honor the Christmas tree. We just got it up, the kids and I, just over the weekend. So the Christmas tree will be a very significant player in Mark Rogers TV over the next few weeks. So give me some suggestions. Maybe I litter it with SEC ornaments for the SEC in 60 or random college football teams for the rest of my segment. So catch me on Mark Rogers TV. If you love college football beyond the SEC or just the SEC, we certainly cover the SEC so in depth that you could just latch on to Mark Rogers TV on YouTube or at markrogerstv.com. If you just love the SEC, college football in general, we cover everybody, especially in Power 5 conference football. We've interviewed, 15 or 16 coaches over the past couple seasons as well. So we've got those interviews on there as well. And follow me on Twitter. This is the SEC in 60, brought to you by the SEC Fans Radio Network, that you can catch us on each day, basically Tuesday through Friday, because we're on live from noon to 1 Eastern time on Monday. So I don't know when Dr. SEC turns it around for Monday, but Tuesday through Friday, catch us on the SEC Fans Radio Network. Listen to us there, 2 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Central. I'll release this on podcast a little bit later in the afternoon on Monday. Thanks so much for joining us. Bowl games galore, 35 of them. We will have as much breakdowns as we possibly can deliver over the next few weeks, and specifically targeting the SEC here on the SEC in 60. May God bless you, and we will catch you next time, and enjoy the football.